the native species is not invasive. So think what you want about cedar. It is not invasive. So let's continue with these two non-native species. So the second part of the invasive species definition is what effects the species have on natural ecosystems. So at least in my vegetable gardens, tomatoes get pretty rambunctious. They kind of get all floppy and they grow over the place. But I don't generally see the tomato spreading into my lawn, spreading into my flower beds. Now, privet is a whole different story. I see privet all over the place, growing in places where people did not plant it and in places where we don't want it. And so this is the second part of the definition. An invasive species needs to be problematic in natural areas. And that is what makes the privet invasive and the tomato not invasive. So here is our definition for tonight. An invasive species is something that is not native to the area and it causes problems when it gets out into natural areas. So that leads to the next question. Why aren't all non-native species invasive? Why don't we have tomatoes growing all along the roadsides or on, growing in all the creeks running through central Texas? To understand why some species become invasive and others are not, we have to understand how plant communities form. So how do all of these species get to the same place and exist together? So the first thing that species have to do is get there. So let's pretend that we're working in some different places where we have a completely blank slate. There's nothing growing there. So it could be something like, some freshly cooled lava if you're in a place like Hawaii, or Iceland's have been having a lot of volcanic eruptions lately. It could be in a place that had been glaciated, which was most of the northern part of our continent about 10,000 years ago. It could be someplace after a wildfire where everything was burned away. It could even be something as small as a bison wallow, just a spot where some kind of animal has scraped away all of the vegetation. So we have these different environments that right now have nothing growing in them. So the first thing the plants need to do is be able to get there. And we've all seen, and then sometimes we also have human-caused places like crop fields where we've taken away all the plants. So plants have different ways of getting where they're going. We've all seen like really fluffy seeds, like this is the old man's beard or dandelion seeds or milkweed seeds that blow around in the wind. Some seeds do the little Velcro thing where they hitchhike on animal fur, or usually in my case, my wool socks. We have other animals that carry things around like squirrels and birds. Coyotes are surprisingly good dispersers of seed because they're a little bit omnivorous. So this is some relatively fresh coyote scat that they look like they've been dining on some prickly pear. And then we move species around all the time too. That's a box of seed that I was spreading on a recently burned area a few years ago. So the first thing plants need to do is they have to be able to get to a site. Once they get there, they have to be able to survive the environment that they arrive in. So if we think through our examples of empty environments, so freshly cooled magma, it probably takes a little while before there's a whole lot of plants that can grow in that. They definitely couldn't grow in the not cooled magma. They'll just burn up. But even like that recently hardened rock, it is just rock. There's no soil. There's nothing for them to grow in. So that's probably a really hard environment for plants to grow in. Glaciers receding, they leave a lot of bare ground, but that's probably a little bit more hospitable. There's a lot of nutrients that have been ground up. All these different kinds of soils have been mixed around. So that's probably a little bit more hospitable. After a wildfire, some plants actually really like fire. They have seeds that are stimulated by the heat or the smoke, and so they'll do really well. Other species that maybe need a lot of shade probably won't do very well after a wildfire. In a place like a bison wallow, the soil there's probably not that different from the soil all around it. So that's probably a relatively easy place to grow. Crop fields can be a little bit hard. It depends on the kind of farming that had been happening. Sometimes there's been some erosions, and so maybe the soil's not quite as good as it was before it was turned into a farm field. Sometimes there's a lot of extra nutrients, and so the plants that do get there, if they can take advantage of all of that extra nitrogen and phosphorus, they might do really well. Once plants get to a place, if they can grow in that physical environment, they also have to compete with all the other plants that are now showing up. So here's some buffalo grass that's growing in a pile burn scar. So it's a relatively bare area, so that's probably pretty easy for the plant to grow. If you've ever dealt with doveweed, it gets a little bit enthusiastic. It makes a lot of shade, but there's still a lot of things that can grow underneath it as long as they don't need too much sun. And then obviously things like some of our invasive species are very, very strong competitors, and it's really hard for other things to grow next to them. If plants can grow in the physical environment and they can compete with the other plants, sometimes there's some other things that they need. So these are some bluebonnet roots. Bluebonnets and a lot of other plants in the legume family can take nitrogen out of the atmosphere and turn it into fertilizer, except that it's not actually the plant that does it. It's some bacteria that the plants host in that little round ball at the bottom that's a nodule that the plant grows, because the bacteria that take the nitrogen out of the air can only do that if there's no oxygen. And so the plant has to grow this little bubble and take all the oxygen out, and then the bacteria can make fertilizer. So this is really good for the plant, but they need those bacteria to be there. There are also a lot of plants that have associations with different kinds of fungi that colonize their roots and help them absorb nutrients out of the soil. And for some of those plants, at least, if they don't have the right kinds of fungi in the soil, the plants won't be able to grow at all. The other kinds of helpers that plants need are pollinators. So many plants need pollinators to move pollen from one individual to another. Otherwise, they won't make seeds. So we have bees and butterflies and birds and bats and all different kinds of things that can be pollinators. And again, if the plants don't have the right kind of pollinators, or if they don't have enough pollinators, then they're really into trouble. And that goes to what Richard was talking about right at the beginning, where we're losing all of these insects. And so plants that need insects for pollination are maybe going to start struggling a little bit. And then plants also have to survive herbivory. There's lots of different things that will eat plants, from big things like deer and bison to small things like caterpillars and beetles and all these other little insects that like to munch on plants. And that's part of why we in our gardens like to grow a variety of plants, because we know that supports a variety of insects. But from the plant's perspective, they'd probably prefer not to get eaten. All right, so let's review how communities form. So plants have to get to a place. They have to be able to survive the environment. They have to compete with the neighbors. They have to find their helpers. And then they have to survive herbivores, or the herbivores have to survive predators. So now let's think about how these 5 things apply to invasive species. So a lot of invasive species get places really easily. They do things like produce abundant seed. Often that seed spreads very easily. Many invasive species are bird dispersed because birds carry seeds all over the place. A lot of them are also wind dispersed, so the wind can just blow the seeds around. Some of them can spread without any seed at all. So things like giant reed can grow from root fragments. Johnson grass does the same thing. If you have just a little root fragment left, or Bermuda grass, just a little root fragment, that's enough to get you a whole new plant. And some invasive species are planted on purpose. You know, a lot of the old world blue stems that we're dealing with were planted on purpose, and you can still go out there and buy seed and go plant a whole pasture full of care blue stem if you want to. Another thing that invasive species have in their favor is that they can survive in many, many, many different environments. KR bluestem, for example, survives in almost any environment except for very shallow soils and very deep shade. And so basically, wherever it shows up, it's going to be able to grow. Many invasive species also thrive in disturbed areas, whether those disturbed areas are small from pigs wallowing around or big disturbed areas like the miles and miles of highway roadside that get mowed multiple times a year. And invasive species also tend to compete really well. They tend to be big, robust plants that grow really quickly, and they can monopolize all the resources, so all the other plants around them can grow very well. So they can get taller, they leaf out earlier, they take up all the water, they catch all the light. And many invasive species don't need specialized friends. So things like Australian bluestem doesn't need any special root fungi the way some of our native grasses do. And many invasive wildflowers are bee pollinated, and honeybees, which are not native to North America, have been spread all over the continent. And there are wild honeybee hives almost everywhere you go. And so if something needs to be pollinated by a honeybee, odds are wherever it shows up, it's going to find a honeybee already there. Invasive species also tend to be really well defended against herbivores. So they might have lots of spikes like the thistle does that make them really unappetizing to deer, because I don't know about you all, but I don't think I want that thistle for a salad. A lot of them also have really tough leaves like the photinias do that make it hard for insects to eat them. And so if they show up in a place, they're monopolizing all the resources, and now nothing's eating them, so they get to grow even better than our native species do. All right, so quick review again. So invasive species, they spread easily, or we spread them on purpose. They survive really well, especially in disturbed areas. They grow really well, so they can outcompete our native species. They generally don't need specific pollinators or soil microbes like fungi, and they tend not to have herbivores or diseases. The things that have a lot of herbivores and diseases just tend not to become invasive. So how can we now think about managing invasive plants, knowing some of the things that make them so invasive? So we'll go through each of these categories to think about how we apply them to invasive species. But before I talk about that, one of the really important things when we think about managing invasive species is that we don't want to make the situation worse. So it's a little bit like the oath that doctors take where they say, first, do no harm. If what I'm going to do to try and help this patient is going to make them sicker, that's probably not going to make the situation better. And so sometimes dealing with an invasive species is so disruptive that it's maybe better just to leave it be. And we'll come back to this a little bit again. So dealing with invasives, the first thing you want to do is slow the ways that they spread. So if you can, remove the seeds and the flowers, because the seeds are what are going to give you more invasive species. And that might be by mowing, it might be by clipping, it might just be going out there and collecting them. Clean equipment when you're moving it between sites. If you're mowing one area where you know there's a lot of invasive species, clean that before you move that mower to another place. This also applies to hiking boots. I spend a lot of time cleaning my hiking boots when I go from one part of the state to another. Vehicles, off-road vehicles that you take, if you have a UTV, or even if you're just visiting a state park, you drive through a bunch of mud, get your car washed before you go to the next place. And then plant native species instead of sowing invasive species all over the place. I love the NICE program that the Native Plant Society has, really encouraging everybody to plant native species instead of all these exotic species. The second way that we can deal with invasive species is try to create environments that are inhospitable to them. So if we prevent or cover bare ground, this is good basic gardening. If we can spread mulch, if we can prevent bare ground from being created, it makes it much harder for the seeds that show up to get established. We can also try to clean up extra nutrients. So if you're working in a place where maybe somebody used to spread a lot of fertilizer on their lawn, or you're working in a place that used to be a farm field, a lot of times cutting all the vegetation and then taking that away, that's, normally we think, oh gosh, everything that I take off of the site, I need to compost and bring back. But if you're working in a place that has a lot of extra nutrients, it's maybe actually good to take all that stuff away, get rid of some of those extra nutrients that are really benefiting the invasive species, and have more of a low nutrient environment, especially here in Central Texas, unless you're lucky enough to live like really far east of I-35, on the west side of I-35, we're on these very shallow, nutrient-poor caliche soils. If we have a lot of extra nutrients in there, it really, really helps the invasive species. You can also create competition. There are native species that compete very strongly with invasive species. So if we have vibrant, healthy native communities, it's really hard for the invasive species to get in there. And we can also, if we don't have those vibrant communities, we can focus on planting some really strong competitors. So things like Maximilian sunflower, which again, in a garden setting gets sometimes a little bit rambunctious, but it has those really big chunky roots that make it really hard for other things to grow around it, or some of our goldenrods, or some of our big grasses. So that's a photo of eastern gamagrass, but things like big blue stem also competes really strongly. We can also add herbivores, and that doesn't always mean literally herbivores. There are some herbivore substitutes. But you can think about, if you're working in a place where maybe you have some cattle or some goats, you can think about the timing of that. So if you're dealing with something like tall fescue that grows in the winter when most of our native grasses are dormant, you can put the cattle out mostly in the winter where they'll eat that tall fescue and then pull them off in the summer from the native grasses. We can use things like prescribed fire very carefully. At the right time of year, it can be really effective at dealing with invasive species. Probably for most of us in our yards or the places we work, manual removal, just going out there, cutting things down, digging them up. This is a bunch of king wrench blue stem that I was cutting out. And sometimes chemical use is going to be your most efficient way to get rid of things. But this is where that principle of first do no harm comes in. If you are going to use chemicals of any kind, and this includes like the horticultural vinegar, think really carefully about how you can minimize the amount of chemical you use. So rather than spraying the entire area, maybe you can walk around and very carefully spray just the invasive species. Or if you're dealing with woody species, you can cut them down and spray the stumps, or there's a lot of very effective hack and squirt techniques where you make some cuts in the bark and you put the herbicide just in those cuts rather than trying to spray all of the leaves. Because chemicals can make our work really efficient, but they're not the best thing to be throwing out there gallons at a time. All right, so how do we deal with invasive species? We want to slow how quickly they spread. We want an environment that is as inhospitable as possible to them. We want to create competition. We want to add herbivores or substitutes for herbivores. So let's now zoom into, so this has all been very broad, but let's zoom into our Central Texas grasslands and think about particularly yellow bluestem or KR bluestem, or King Ranch bluestem, you might hear it called. And so some people come to me and say, well, it's called King Ranch bluestem. Clearly it must be from Texas because the King Ranch is in Texas. Well, the reason it's called that is that the King Ranch was one of the first places where they really researched this grass as something that would be good for cattle to graze. And so King Ranch kind of put their stamp on it. I think maybe now, hopefully they regret that a little bit. So how do we know what grass we're looking at? Well, it has kind of this turkey foot seed head that's a little bit like a big bluestem seed head. But if you look really carefully at the little nodes that the grasses have, a lot of times they'll have hairs on them. And this grass also has very hairy leaves, and the hairs tend to come off the flat part of the leaves. Something like side oats grama, you only have hairs that come off the little sides. It is from Eurasia. It is really interesting because people in Eastern Europe are really struggling to maintain their yellow bluestem grasslands because they're doing less and less grazing, less pasture. And this is a very disturbance dependent grass. It actually kind of likes getting grazed. And so if you're in a situation where you take the cattle off, it doesn't do very well. But it was introduced to the US accidentally, but then they figured out that it's very grazing tolerant. And so particularly after the drought of the 1950s, people started spreading it around, and you can still go buy it from Turner Seed and some of the other big seed companies. Unfortunately, what they then figured out once they got it out into a lot of native grasslands is that part of what makes it just grazing tolerant is that it's not particularly tasty to cattle. And so they will eat almost all of our native grasses first before they go this. So if you imagine like a buffet line, our native grasses are the ice cream and this is the kale. And I like kale, but it's always the last thing that's left at the buffet line. So what KR Bluestem does is take a vibrant, diverse community like this, where we have all of these different native grasses and native wildflowers, and each of these wildflowers has a particular insects that depend on them. So we all know the association between monarch butterflies and milkweeds, but there's lots of other insects that have very particular native grasses or native wildflowers that they'll lay their eggs on. And what all of those insects then allow, all those insects then become food for birds and small mammals. And those insects really are the base of the food web. But if we lose all of this native diversity and we turn it into a monoculture of KR bluestem or yellow bluestem, we lose the insects, we lose the birds and everything else that depends on them. So let's think about the ways that I talked about dealing with invasive species in general, and then think about how we deal with these invasive bluestems in particular. They really do get spread a lot by mowing equipment. You see them kind of move along roadsides over time as they get spread. And TxDOT still, at least until recently, has been planting these bluestems on the roadsides because they are very effective at holding the soil in place. So cleaning equipment and planting alternative native species will help slow the spread. The bluestems really don't do well in shade. So if you are in a situation where, you can kind of make a decision, well, do I want a sun garden or a shade garden? This might be a time to think about planting some trees and having a shade garden if that's going to fit what you're trying to do. But if you still want something in the sun, shade is not an option. These are native plants that have been found in different research studies to be quite effective competitors with the old world bluestem. So things like big bluestem, yellow prairie grass, what people used to call Indian grass, side oats grama, silver bluestem, and then we already talked about Maximilian sunflower. So if you can get some of these other grasses established, they can kind of compete with the old world bluestems. We can also add herbivores or herbivore substitutes. I've been involved with several research studies that fire late summer, early fall. The window might actually be even a little bit bigger than that. Anytime probably from July to early November, if you can do fire, you're probably going to hurt these invasive grasses. We have tried doing solarization. We did it with black plastic and it didn't work so well, but I think if you do it with clear plastic, after a good rain or after you have watered the soil, that clear plastic then kind of creates a greenhouse effect where all that moisture turns into steam, and you kind of steam sterilizing the spot. You'll definitely want to sow native species after you take the plastic off, though. Like, this is not a situation where you're just going to put the plastic on, kill the invasive, and then walk away, because it's probably just going to come back. Manual removal, digging it up, is always an option. It is very labor intensive. These grasses, they're bunch grasses, but particularly if they've been mowed, they kind of tend to spread out. And so it's quite a lot of work to dig them up. I have had pretty good luck cutting them. Mowing doesn't work really well because you can't get the mower close enough to the ground. But if you have just a few individuals, if you kind of dig down, you'll find there's a little spot at the bottom of the grass where the leaves kind of meet the roots. And if you snip it off right there, that's about 75% effective. It's 100% effective if you follow it up for the next six to 12 months and kind of reclip it. Because this grass comes from ecosystems in Eastern Europe, Mongolia, where it's very heavily grazed, grazing generally just makes it happy and benefits it, and so does mowing. There's some indication that maybe if you mow it in late summer when it's about to flower, maybe you can knock it back a little bit, but it's not nearly as effective as some of the other control techniques. So that was a lot about scary things, like a lot of invasive species. I sometimes find it hard to talk about invasives because it feels like a really, really overwhelming problem. But there's things that we can do, and if we can do those things, we can end up with really beautiful, vibrant native places. So this is the Nature Conservancy's Clymer Meadow Preserve in North Texas. All of that yellow is Maximilian sunflower. It's doing a great job of keeping all the invasives out. This is from West Texas, where we have these really cool shrubland communities that survive on basically no water. Creeks in West Texas and Central Texas that are so important for water and also really nice in the summer to go play in. Here's another prairie in North Texas with just this really cool blazing star species that blooms in June. And it's a little bit like walking through an alien landscape because these plants are so cool. And the reason that I do what I do every day, these are my two girls. They're both a little bit taller now. But I think the reason that we really want to deal with invasive species is that we want to keep Texas looking like Texas so that the people who come after us can still have this beautiful, vibrant state that we all live in. And if you want some more resources for specific invasive species, here are two websites that have databases with very specific control information. So if you're dealing with a particular species, both of these are places that are good to go to for some information about if you want to use herbicides, what herbicides work, if you want to do manual removal. Sometimes they have information about fire and grazing too. So that is what I have, and I would love to take some questions and hear what you all are thinking about.
You have a question coming so she can hear it and we can record it. Questions?
There goes one.
I frequently hear about having I always forget the correct term, controlled burn. I have found it's almost impossible to do that. I can't find, there are insurance issues, they're finding people to man it. There's just a tremendous amount that keeps that from being an effective activity for me, at least. And I've got a large area of the yellow blue stem that I'd like to get rid of, but I've yet to find a way to burn it.
Yeah, no, and I always feel like I should talk about fire with a little asterisk because it is very hard to do. There's some legislation that they've passed that help a little bit with the liability issues. There are some contractors you can get that can help you with that. Some areas they have prescribed burn associations where landowners get together and they share equipment and expertise to help each other burn their properties. But yes, it is a very hard thing to do, particularly in the summer and fall when things tend to be dry. That tends to be when the burns for yellow bluestem are most effective, and that those are some of the hardest times of year to burn. So what I would suggest is just, if you have a big area, don't try to tackle it all at once. Take little bite-sized pieces, and whether you use some chemical, whether you go dig it up, whether you solarize it with plastic, just start working a little area at a time. Something that I have been wanting to experiment with, but haven't yet, I have observed in areas where you have a lot of yellow bluestem, if you do nothing, so no grazing, no fire, no mowing, no disturbance of any kind, this grass starts to smother itself. It produces just so many leaves, and they just stick around year after year. They end up with this really, really thick thatch. And you end up, over time, you get more and more thatch and less green. Now, I've not seen our native species get into those areas by themselves, and I don't think seeding would be effective, but it would be interesting to plug plant. Like if you can get reasonables, not like really, really tiny seedlings, but if you can get, like a fairly robust little bluestem, yellow prairie grass, some Maximilian sunflower, and plant that into the thatch. I'm really curious to see if they can then establish and start pushing the yellow bluestem out. But that's just an idea. The other thing that I have tried that's sometimes a little bit easier than a prescribed burn is to build brush piles. So if you have places on your property where you're cutting down woody material of any kind, build some brush piles, burn those. You're going to sterilize the soil, which is usually a bad thing. But in this case, that means you kill all the yellow bluestem and you kill all the yellow bluestem seed. And then come behind that and sow native seed into those pile scars. My experience with getting stuff established in this pile scars is a little bit mixed. You often have to go back several times, but buffalo grass seems to do really well. And I have pile scars that are maybe about 5 or 6 years old at this point. And it's only now that the yellow bluestem is starting to come back. And so if you can kind of at least start using brush piles or maybe some plastic just to create little islands of diversity in this big field with just yellow bluestem, you'll at least be making progress. So it is a difficult species to deal with.